Hi, and welcome to class for maximizing income. If this is your first class, then you're going to want to backtrack to building skills for financial confidence. If this is the fourth class, then you should have just did building a better budget. So what this class is going to be a follow through from the budget. So it's going to be the next steps after you filled out that budget. It's going to be about maximizing your income and how you can get the most out of what you are budgeting for and how you're going to get the most in moving into savings. So maximizing income is not necessarily maximizing your income, like increasing your income, but it's more of getting the most out of what you're bringing in. So throughout this session, we're going to kind of talk about how you make the adjustments and just the action planning steps of what goes through for that. And then I'm also going to tell you about some tips and tricks of how to be successful moving forward. So basically, this is going to be the lead in for savings. So following those tips and tricks and following through this action plan is how you're going to start working on creating that savings so that you can move forward and start really working towards achieving those goals. So this is the same cycle we kind of saw before. The picking goal goes back to class 2. Calculating and tracking income and expenses is going to go back to class 3. And then the assessing current situation and making adjustments is going to be kind of more about this class and what you're going to get out of this. Creating an action plan is going to be the follow through, and that's just that's the next step of how to get into the next portion of what happens when you're trying to become a better financial person overall and work on really achieving those goals. So assessing your current situation is going to relate back to your budget that you just did. So you want to assess if you're in the positive or negative and how well your budget worked out. Were you more conscious looking at your budget this time, or were you more carefree? Did it work out for you? Did you overcompensate? Did you undercompensate? Did you really, where are you at currently with the situation of your goal, your finances, and your budget that you've just completed? So the next thing that's going to be making adjustments. So once you really assess where you are, it's going to help you realize if you need to adjust in a good way or in a bad way. And I mean that by adjusting in a good way, are you able to start putting more money into savings? Or in a bad way, are you going to have to start cutting things in your budget or really starting to track and keep on top of it? So that's kind of what maximizing income is. It's not necessarily the good, but it's kind of the in-between of the good and the bad. So it's getting you out of that, having to cut things, but also getting you ready to start that savings. And then the action plan is just going to be the steps that you take to make sure that you're able to start working on that savings, which is what we'll talk about in the next class. So spending, what is it? So there's kind of 5 components of spending that are important to talk about. They're not necessarily linked together, but they are all part of maximizing that income and adjusting your budget and making that adjustment step. So spending leaks. This is the number one thing that we see happen in everyone's budget. Everyone out there has had some kind of spending leak along the way. So spending leak is where you're spending money and not really realizing it, so it's kind of slipping through your fingers. So a good one for this is eating out and spending money at the grocery store. Those are the 2 places that we see a lot of spending leaks happen the most often and the most regularly. So in order to kind of keep on track of those spending leaks, that's where you have to start really tracking, which is also part of spending as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But identifying those spending leaks is the first step of starting to make those adjustments. Wants and needs. So spending on wants is typically going to be what those goals are going to be. So you're going to want to kind of maybe start cutting some of those wants out if you're really not making your budget work out. They're not things you need to survive off of, and those are definitely things you can work towards in your goals. Whereas your needs, you want to make sure that you're spending money on your needs, but you're not overspending on your needs. So that's where the 50-30-20 and the 65-25-10 rule fall into place. So most people probably start out at the 65-25-10 rule. As you make adjustments and you work on that budget and you really work on increasing your income and different things, hopefully you can move into that 50-30-20 rule where you're now spending 15% less on the necessities and you're spending 15% more on those savings and those wants that you have, that you can move into that. And a lot of that comes from tracking. So leading back to the tracking from spending leaks, you're going to identify those things by tracking your income and tracking everything you're spending and what you're spending it on. So tracking can be simple as, just tracking the amount of money that you're spending throughout the month that you're budgeting. So it could be, okay, this Sunday I spent this amount of money at the grocery store. This Sunday I spent this amount of money at the grocery store. Or it could be, okay, I spent, $50 more at the grocery store this week. What did I buy this week that I didn't buy last week? Or what did I, buy the week before that I spent more on that I didn't even eat this week? What can be cut from my tracking and my spending? So it's really just the nitty gritty of getting deep and down into that budget and really, really tracking what you're spending and watching where your money is going. So the action planning. So the first step you're going to want to do is cut out those wants. That is the number one thing that's going to help you get that budget on plan and make adjustments and move forward towards your savings. Now, it is important that you do allow yourself some kind of want in life, because most people can't just live off the basic necessities, because it makes life, not really worth doing all the savings and wants and all those things. So you want to make sure that you're still maybe including some of those ones, but you are cutting as much as you can to make your budget work. The best way to do this is to prioritize your wants. Going back to prioritizing goals, you can do the same thing with your wants. You can prioritize what wants are more important. And if you think that you're a person who's living paycheck to paycheck just on needs and essentials, I bet you somewhere along the line you might be able to find something that you can cut that could be considered a want if you prioritize things and made lists and worked through that as well. Spending plan is going to be the next action step. So not necessarily creating that spending plan, but it's going to be to identify the spending plan. Where do you really want to start working on the spending problems? Is it the whole way through the budget, or is it maybe in one specific area? So is it on clothing and shopping? Is it on eating out? Is it on just what you spend at the grocery store? Really kind of identifying what spending plan you want to use and where you want to utilize it. And then, of course, reviewing your budget guidelines. So once you start cutting once and you start cutting into that spending plan and getting that adjusted, that's where you start reviewing your budget guidelines and you start setting new goals for yourself and you reestablish that budget. So going back to the last thing we talked about in the last class with budgeting, about how you set goals for what you want. This is kind of where the budget guideline falls in. You want to readjust those goals. So for example, if you have a want as, you have Hulu, Netflix, and Disney Plus, but you really don't watch that much TV, so just having one of them is a suffice. That's maybe $20 that you're cutting out. So that's going to be where you review your budget guideline and where you're really falling behind. And that's where you can adjust and put that extra $20. And then lastly, for your action plan, the actual last step is going to be creating that spending plan and following through with that spending plan. So if you decide your spending plan is going to be to, really check your grocery list every month or every week, and you're really going to see what you're spending and what you're buying and what you're using and not using, that's going to be your spending plan, and that's going to be where you start tracking things. So spending plans and tracking go hand in hand together, and they're typically look similar. So the spending plan is the goals and the tracking is keeping track of if the spending plan is following through. So how to be successful in maximizing income and just budgeting in general to get yourself pushing towards those savings. So the first thing is to be realistic. So as I've stated before in past class, it's important to be realistic about what you're spending money on. Even if it's $525, you want to make sure you're writing it's $525. Another thing that's kind of weird about realistic things is a lot of people say, well, the shirt was only $19.99, but you have to include that as tax in there as well. So being realistic about the actual amounts that you're spending and being realistic about your budget. Like if you can't spend $600 in groceries, you need to be realistic about that. And you really need to think about, being open-minded to changing your budget around in those habits. You need to be specific, not necessarily with, your rent and utilities, but you want to be specific about the things that you want to spend money on. So if you really want to spend money on, you don't have cable, but you really need something because you have children and you need to entertain them, you need to be specific of what you're cutting and your reasons why. So that'll help you, maybe build those habits of not really relying on those things and having concrete reasons as to why you specifically don't need those anymore. You want to plan for the unexpected. So for people who have cars and drive cars, once a year you have to get your car inspected, and every 3 or 6 months or however often you drive, you have to have oil changes. So those are things that are not necessarily expected every month that you plan for in your budget, but you want to make sure you're including those things in your spending plans. So a cool thing that I like to tell people, or a cool trick that I kind of use on my budget specifically, I have a category that's just like miscellaneous, and I try to put $10 into that every time that, I get paid. So that way, when those unexpected things come up, I have a miscellaneous category in my budget that I can use, that I can move forward. Or, making sure that I have that extra $10 at the end of the month, making sure it's included in my budget and considered an expense I spent, but it's actually just in my bank account. So when something unexpected happens, I have it there. The fourth thing is account for essentials first. So you want to make sure that you're adding up your essentials and making sure that you're costly affording those, and that you're not having an issue along the way with not being able to afford rent or put food on your table. So being successful and maximizing your income means that your essentials are coming first. And if those are the things that you need to cut down on, then that's what you're focusing on first. Include support for others included in your budget. So if you're a parent, or you take care of a parent, or you take care of a child, someone's child, or whatever your situation is, or your spouse, your partner, whoever, you want to make sure the cost that you're taking into account the cost for them. So for example, if you have kids, you want to make sure that you're including the amount of money that, your kids you may pay for your kids. So you might specifically spend $100 at the grocery store, but you also have to account for the support that you have for your kids. Same with transportation. Typically, most people just drive to and from their job, to and from the store, whatever. But if you have kids, then you have to include that support for taking your kids to school, or taking your kids to after school activities, or taking your kids to the doctors, or whatever it may be. So you want to make sure that in order to be successful in budgeting and maximizing that income, that you're also including those things as well. Try something new or different. So budgeting can get very tricky and very stressful, and so is finances, and the whole idea of money gets very frustrating and can very quickly escalate. Not necessarily a bad way, but to money slipping away, to, being stressed out, living paycheck to paycheck, being in the negative, whatever it may be. So if you find that, the way that you're budgeting now isn't really working out, it's time to try something new and different. So if you're trying to cut money from groceries and it's just not working for you, maybe trying a different category, trying something different. Maybe instead of, going to the grocery store on a Saturday, you go on a Sunday, and maybe that'll even make a difference because it's, you're not accounting for that extra meal. Or maybe going a different way to work so that you're not passing, 4 Dunkin' Donuts or whatever it may be that's kind of triggering you to go spend money there. Recognize prioritized expenses can and will change. So try something new. Make sure that, you're understanding that everything is going to change. One month your budget might be perfect, and the next month you might be $10 behind. Or one month that you might be $100 behind, and the next month you're $25 ahead. So you need to recognize that prioritized expenses in your budget can change, and that they don't have to be a prioritized expense in your budget. Some things do, like rent, utilities, but things like cable and TV, your phone bill, those are things that can be prioritized, but they can also be adjusted as well if you take the time to really focus on those things. And then the last thing is identify and discuss pros and cons of spending habits and values. So this is kind of the overall most important thing, especially if you are a family, to discuss the things that are happening, your habits, your family's habits, and the values that your family has. Your family might value that, having a family meal together every single night is important to you. So discuss the pros and cons with your family as to why that's important to you. Is it important that we sit down and spend an hour making this big dinner? Or could we order pizza one night? Or instead of ordering pizza one night, can we maybe make pizzas instead? To have those discussions and identify, having those conversations and talking is the most successful way to be, or is the most important way to be successful at anything that you do, including budgeting and including maximizing income. So once you kind of have things together and you're really maximizing that income, as in, your budget's working out, you have all those extra things, and you're really stretching every dollar that you have, that's when savings comes into play, which is going to be the next class. So once, we're working on maximizing your income, now we're going to work on savings and how we're going to start savings and everything that goes into that. And in the next class, we're also going to talk about, the percentages and maybe some calculations of savings, because sometimes people, don't understand those as well. And it's important to maybe utilize those. So again, if you need any more resources or have any questions, you may reach out to me. You can call our office for a referral, whatever it may be. And then hopefully you will be able to move on to the next class, savings, and you'll be majority of the way through or you'll be pretty much through, and you should be able to have a better idea of the guidance and steps it takes to be fully, moving successful into achieving those goals along the way.